for this round. With me is a wonderful panel. Kindly introduce yourselves by order of the tab.
Part one is Addie. Good luck to the round.
Any of the panel, you can just proceed.
Hello everyone, my name is Justin, one of the panelists. Good luck and congratulations already.
Hello, this is Kaya. Good luck. Hello, Lou, one of the panelists. Congrats and good luck.
All right, I think that's everyone. Some gentle reminders that our equity policies are still in play. Do your trigger warnings before your speech. Also, please do time yourselves. Judges will no longer be taking notes beyond 7:15. Um, other than that, let's proceed with the debate. Debating on the motion, this House opposes the stigmatization of resentment. Calling on PM. You're here.
Sorry, give me a moment to. Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear. Am I audible on your end? Or
Oh, okay.
whenever you're ready. Yeah.
Right, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, because this is a finals and we don't want a messy debate, we want to be very clear what we are defending. This is not a debate about whether resentment as an emotion is good or bad, because we don't think we need stigma to resent in the first place for two reasons. One, that society is already naturally opposed to resentment and hatred by virtue of the fact that we prioritize certain values such as forgiveness. For example, religious institutions that prioritize values like forgive and forget as a way to preach self improvement, or how resentment is naturally seen as an antithesis to these values. But the second reason, that resentment builds, but you still have some form of attachment to the other person in your relationship. That is to say, the resentment is something that builds over time from small actions that are repeated over and over again. And over the course of this, positive interaction is still likely to happen. So this means that we are naturally likely to feel guilty for having this form of resentment to begin with. Anyways, given that people reasonably feel bad about placing strain or stress on their friendships. The thing that we are opposing is the stigmatization of resentment, the narrative of shame and guilt that you feel once you start feeling the emotion of resentment. This happens in two ways. One, internally, when you feel extremely guilty for like hating your partner, you have this cycle of depression because you begin to rationalize your resentment as something that's incredibly terrible. Your judgment as a person is tied to how you can believe you can overcome these emotions of resentment, and then you begin to factor this into your self reflection. But it also happens, secondly, externally, when people tell you that you are a bad person for feeling resentment, your friends, for example, when you try ranting to them, when you take these into account, especially when they're constantly reinforced by the people who are the most proximate to you. That leads me to our first argument, that a world without the stigmatization of resentment is a world that fundamentally betters relationships. And there's two tiers to this. The first tier on toxic relationships, and the second tier on relationships in general. So, on the first tier of toxic relationships, the premise here is that oftentimes people in toxic relationships are isolated isolated from social support for a couple of reasons. One, that their abuser is a terrible person who prevents or interferes with the victim's meaningful relationships as a way to strengthen their control, or two, that these victims often feel stress or fear when it comes to interacting with other people, given that they are unclear as to how relationships are supposed to function and thus avoid them. But this is important for two reasons. One, that these people are already vulnerable, and therefore, long-term abuse and toxic relationships often result in a fragile state of mind where they're unable to rationally reflect on the relationship at hand. But two, that these individuals have no other avenues of help and support, given that they feel that they are alone, they feel as if they have no alternatives. So, on opposition, this leads to scenarios where they beat themselves up for feeling even more resentment, given that they are unable to rationalize the resentment they feel and believe that they deserve the abuse as they feel that they are a bad person for feeling resentment in the first place. But on our comparative, where we say that our side probably normalizes resentment, that is to say, these individuals are less likely to feel that much shame or feeling angry at the way that they've been treated. This looks like recognizing that the anger they feel at the first signs of their abuse in a relationship is something that's incredibly valid, or how these people are less likely to brush aside their resentment as being problematic or a flaw in their relationship, and are thus more likely to reflect on how or why they feel this certain way. But all of this is important because these individuals then have a better grasp on their state of relationship and are then likely to be more rational. They're then likely to take into account what actually happens in these toxic or abusive relationships, and maybe they'll be able to escape them and find better people and find better lives for themselves. We think this is all incredibly good. But then on to the next tier of just relationships in general, and there are a couple of tiers to this. So the first thing to prove is that genuine relationships need you to reconcile with the root of your resentment. And that's proving that resentment oftentimes happen not because people are just inherently bad or like other than the cases of toxic or abusive relationships, but oftentimes result from things like miscommunication when you're unable to fully articulate to your friends or your partner the reason why certain things irritate you. And at the point in which these things build over time, that's when resentment starts to manifest. But the reconciliation of your resentment is incredibly important because one, we owe something to each other. And here we're talking about the kind of resentment that builds up over small conflicts and small differences that through a culmination of time eventually reaches a point where the mere sight of the other person or the mere mention of their name evokes a very strong or negative response. Except the fact that these relationships were once built off trust. And at the point in which you already buy into the fact that these relationships were something that are meant to like initially be positive and initially be a good thing to you, you then bear yourself out. Think this form of vulnerability means you have to take accountability for your actions. We think you definitely need to reconcile with the root of your resentment. But the second thing on deception, that we can only obtain genuine relationships through things like being honest. Because we think that at the point in which you have a facade and you masquerade as someone who isn't really yourself, who, when you shut out the feeling of resentment because you feel as if this isn't a very good thing because society tells you that you have to be shamed for doing it, then we think that this, at the point in which this happens, you're no different from just living in an experienced machine because you have no basic respect for the humanity. You don't take into account the very person that the other person is. But the second thing to prove that the problem generally arises, that is, reconciliation is inherently an incredibly difficult process. This is true for a couple of reasons. One, that you might start getting a bit defensive when you feel as if you're not at fault and you don't really understand the reasons why you feel resentment. Or two, a miscommunication when you can't articulate your ideas to other people. But three, all of this is incredibly problematic because it's even worse with stigma, because stigma manifests in the form of shame, where internally you have already an irrational state of mind, but externally people persuade you that this is a bad thing and you shouldn't be able to reconcile with this at all. Then proving the next thing. Three, that in the absence of stigmatization, it's far easier to confront the source of your resentment. That is to say, you have sources of external help where you reach out to friends through the processes of maybe ranting or just bearing your soul out to them, but they don't shame you for all of these things. They feel as if your resentment is something that's incredibly valid. We think this is an incredibly good thing. But second thing, that you learn when it's appropriate to hold difficult conversations, because this is important because we live in a community, we live in a society where the only way you can understand your place in this society is the value that you have to your friends, your responsibility and your obligations to them, We think that at the point in which you remove the stigma, you remove shame, like as a mechanism that prevents all of these things from happening, you get far better relationships on our side. For all these reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
All right, thank you for the time speech to present the case of opposition. LO. Here.
Hello, I'm leader of opposition. My name is Sophia Caguiat, pronouns she, her. POI preference, please unmute yourself. I don't check the chat, I don't check the screen. Trigger warnings, I will be talking about abuse. Is that okay with everybody in this room? Can I just get like a confirmation through the chat, please? If the,
Rob, opposition is asking for consent. Do you consent?
hello?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. So I think that's it. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In the 1930s, the only reason that Hitler was able to carry out a full scale ethnic cleansing of the Jewish people was because he utilized resentment onto the Jewish people. He used the hardships that the Germans were going through and he pointed a finger and said, "You should feel resentful against them. They're the reason we're in this situation." This resentful rhetoric is one of the reasons why ethnic cleansing, why displacement is something that has become so normalized in society and even carries over now into like the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, for example. Now, before I move on to my arguments, a few rebuttals towards Prime Minister. Firstly, their framework is that you don't need a stigma against resentment because as a society, people automatically value values like, for example, forgive and forget. Panel, realize that is the stigma. The stigma is prioritizing forgiving and forgetting in society. So I really don't know what they're trying to achieve with this framework. It's kind of disingenuous and it only attributes itself to our side. Secondly, they tell you in their framework that resentment is something that builds up over time. And I'd really like to thank them for this framing. Why is this? Because they tell you that when you're in a relationship, you're going to beat yourself up for feeling resentful if you're in an abusive relationship. And we tell you this is a good thing because when you're in a relationship and you feel resentful and then you say, "I'm feeling resentful, I should not be in a relationship where I feel resentment." Resentfulness is a red flag, and it means that either there's something wrong with your partner, there's something wrong with the relationship, whether this is on you or this is on them. And what we're saying on our side is, why would you allow these things to become a long term, like why would you allow your resentment to forge itself over time? Why would you prefer a world in which you stew in your emotions, in which you stew in abusive relationships, rather than getting angry, knowing your worth, and deciding to leave them rather? This is also when they tell you that it helps you confront your abuser. Panel, realize that in the framing they gave you, resentment only happens when you dwell on these things for a large portion of time, when you keep it inside and you don't tell anyone about it, when you only tell your friends about it. Now, let's move on to our constructives, therefore. Let's tell you why resentfulness is the stigmatization of resentfulness is actually something that we will take on opposition side. Firstly, resentment creates a cycle of anger. For example, you know the saying, "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." Few structural reasons for this. Firstly, resentment fuels retaliatory behavior, leading to an endless cycle of conflict because you become fixated on past grievances instead of seeking solutions. You stay in toxic, in abusive relationships rather than deciding to leave it because you would rather stew in your own resentment rather than getting over it. Secondly, this leads to revenge seeking behaviors, therefore. And what you see is a society that stews in their resentment, stews in their grievances, rather than seeking proactive solutions. Secondly, you get polarization between different parties. People are less willing to engage with other people, they're less willing to engage with their other people's perspectives, and there becomes a gridlock in society when you allow your resentment to fuel how you see the world, when you allow your grievances to stay with you for the rest of your life. You don't see people being able to have productive discussions. For example, the resentment between the Democratic and Republican Party that we literally just discussed in the round before this where compromise is seen as betrayal. Third structural reason, this resentment festers. Like they told you, it's a long-term thing. So it fosters like this us versus them mentalities on a larger scale. It clouds judgment. Resentment leads to xenophobia and racism across groups. And this means that people in marginalized communities are so much more vulnerable to resentment from people who have a grievance against them. So in terms of scale, you see a more violent and cruel society, you see instability, and in terms of vulnerability, you see minority groups and marginalized institutions suffer the most because resentment justifies discrimination. For example, during COVID-19, people blamed Asians for COVID-19, which was completely just insane. Secondly, on long-termism, when you have more resentment, it becomes harder to repair societal divides. Now, why does it have to be resentment that solves this? Why does it have to be stigma that solves this resentment instead of literally any other way? First structural reason for this: resentment driven propaganda absolutely thrives in environments without this stigma. For example, populist leaders and extremist groups need resentment to mobilize their followers. For example, when Donald Trump is telling his people the reason he won the election was because people want mass deportation. When you have these sorts of things stigmatized, if it's stigmatized and people are like, hey, that's kind of messed up, man. The fact that you're running and your platform is that you're going to get rid of a bunch of people, it means that their appeal disappears. For example, Hitler appealed to the German populace by blaming the Jews. When you take away the validity of resentment, when you say that resentment is a bad thing, beyond just like beyond the basic stigma that you have, yes, I'll take your POI.
On both sides, people are still going to feel resentment. So you'd rather have people be unable to seek help and because resentment is seen as something bad and immoral.
Yeah, actually, I'm really thanking you for that POI, because that was just about to be my next point. Actually, yeah, resentment exists on both sides of the house. But on your side of the house, you encourage resentment. You allow people to stew in their resentment. For example, when you feel resentful towards somebody, you go and tell your friends, hey, I really fucking hate this guy. Sorry for the cursing. I really hate this guy. And they affirm this to you. And then it creates an echo chamber where you're like, yeah, that guy really sucks. Rather, when you're in a society that stigmatizes resentment, you go to your friends, you say, hey, this guy really sucks. They're like, yeah, this guy really sucks. What should we do about it? Because the difference between resentment and anger is that resentment is long term. It's something that you dwell on, and then it's something that you stew in. The difference is, on our side of the house, we tell you you're allowed to feel anger towards your abusers. You're allowed to feel anger towards your rapists, towards people who abuse you. You're allowed to feel anger towards people who you are in conflict with. The difference is, rather, instead of encouraging somebody to stew in it, which is a framing that was provided to us by government side, by the way, they tell you that resentment is something that stews long term, even just from like small actions. You start feeling jealous or resentful towards your friend, and it's something that you stew on for a large portion of time. So we're not telling you that you don't have negative emotions anymore. Negative emotions will always still exist, but rather the difference between government and opposition side is, on government side, they tell you that it's okay to feel resentful, and so you should just stew in that resentfulness. You die bitter. On our side, we tell you, when you feel resentfulness, you should turn that resentfulness into anger. Rather, you make your resentfulness, instead of resentfulness, you feel anger, you feel sadness, you feel your feelings. That's super healthy, guys. You feel your feelings and you do something about it. You instead of staying in that abusive relationship, you get up and you leave. Instead of stewing in a relationship that you don't even like, instead of being in a friendship where you resent somebody for constantly putting you down, you instead decide to leave. And that's why our side is so important, because we tell you that stigma is the only way to prevent it, because it removes the victim mindset that people have, because it removes the victim mindset, and it tells people, yes, somebody did something to you. What are you going to do about it? And so, if you want a healthier society, if you want a society where you see solvency in actual conflicts, you have to go with decision. Thank you.
Here. And whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Can I check that I'm audible?
Yep, you're clear.
Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. It's very disappointing that I think we'll lose in the finals after we've all debated so many days and everyone's watching this. But I think there needs to be a major motion clarification here, because I think opposition is the issue understanding. basic English. Few things I want to clarify. The first thing, what is resentment actually? Resentment is a strong feeling of hatred. Sure, we tell that resentment often builds up over time, but they can't just weaponize a single piece of framing and build their entire case around it. Presumably on their side, they still stigmatize resentment. They stigmatize the manifestation of resentment in the form of anger. We know these things are all incredibly interconnected and they're all incredibly similar emotions that probably all come together as a whole. Secondly, what does stigmatization look like? Judge, I want you to be extremely clear. What LO came up to you and told you was that in their case, people would stigmatize resentment and turn it into anger. We tell you that oftentimes these emotions are incredibly similar. We tell you that anger is simply the manifestation of resentment. What they need to defend is the stigmatization of resentment. What does stigmatization look like? What does it look like when we say we stigmatize migrant workers, for example? It means you look at it in a bad light. It means you look at them in a biased light. It means it looks like you saying this is an immoral thing. It looks like you telling a person you ought not to feel resentful because feeling resentful is bad. You are a bad person if you feel resentful. It looks like when you express your feelings of resentment in society, people demonize you, people look down upon you, people shame you, and people make you feel guilty. That is the delta that we need to defend within this debate. I want this to be extremely clear. But next, let's move on to some of the wildest claims I've ever heard in a debate. Because there's actually no way L will begin her speech talking about Hitler and talking about how this motion realistically applies to Nazi Germany. I have a few responses. The first thing is just that in these moments of extremity, what's holding people back presumably isn't the stigmatization of religion, but rather a respect of basic human rights, right? Is the fact of the matter that we respect human life, that we want to have basic human dignity, that we stop these people from doing crazy things. I don't understand how the idea of resentment is a delta within this debate. I think this is extremely uncharitable from them. Okay, but nextly, I want to talk about this idea of this really weird claim they have of resentment because they say that on their side, people will be able to move on better because they feel their emotions. Hold on, we think that's crossing the house because we think the prior explanation of stigmatization was one where people demonize the manifestation of this resentment. This crucially means that on their side of the house, people feel scared to express their resentment. People feel scared to feel the emotion of resentment because at the point in which you feel it, you are demonized. At the point in which you feel it, you are stigmatized. But secondly, another piece of framing I want to be extremely clear about, as Lauren stated in her POI, they don't prove why people magically don't feel resentment on their side. And it's why I think they don't understand the nuance of the motion. This debate is not this house believes that resentment is good. This debate is this house opposes the stigmatization of resentment. I want to be extremely clear. People still feel resentment because it is a basic human emotion. Because sometimes people piss you off and you are a human being, it's okay to be pissed off. There is a very big difference there. So we think on both sides, people still feel pissed off. The difference in this debate is what happens when people feel pissed off. We think on our side, uniquely, you are all more able to express it. How are you able to express it? We think you are able to rant to your friends without judgment. We think you stop doubting your own emotions and you go, okay, I'm angry. This is fine. Why am I angry? We think uniquely when you're able to verbalize your thoughts, when you stop doubting yourself, that is when you gain the courage, that is when you gain the mental clarity to break free from the toxic relationships they so wanted to talk about. This is why I really want to move on to the idea of the clash on toxic relationships, because I think they don't actually respond to any of the things Lauren told you. They simply counter assert. The problem with this narrative about the stigmatization of resentment is one that is one that's weaponized to a very pernicious degree within these toxic relationships. It looks like a toxic spouse saying, "Hey, why are you so resentful? Yeah, like not very nice, right?" You feel scared. You start wondering and questioning whether you are the one in the wrong, whether you should be even feeling resentful or not. This feeling of self-doubt makes you feel incredibly scared. It clouds your rationality because you don't want to feel like the worst person. This is what makes escaping incredibly hard. We think comparatively on our side, and the nuance judge is this. There is a spectralization of the time period within a toxic relationship. Within in the short term, you oftentimes feel that something is going wrong. You feel a bit resentful. But I think on the outside, you would validate your own feelings of resentment early on. You would either talk it out or you would leave, saving a lot of people trouble. Secondly, we think in the long term, this allows you to break free from the power asymmetry. It allows you to break free from the cage of toxic relationships, something that's incredibly important because you allow your feelings to be valid, because you feel confident in yourself that you want to leave. But secondly, about the extension of relationships, something they never responded to. We told you two crucial impacts. Number one, you get personal growth so you don't repeat the same mistakes that you've had. You evolve and become better as a person. But secondly, And this is why I'm willing to trade off against the best version of their case about conflicts. So sure, maybe you allow some form of conflict in the short term because people are more willing to express their anger. We say you stop conflict in the long run because the worst sort of conflicts are those where anger builds up over a very, very long time, but people are too scared to express it. So one day it eventually explodes like a volcano and it overflows everywhere. We think on the outside, you snip it off at the butt because you allow people to express their dissatisfaction from the very get-go. But now I'm going to explain to run a principle and explain to you why, independent of all practical outcomes, this principle is important and win this debate. I'm going to explain to you why catharsis is something that's core to the human experience. The premise of this claim is that we don't fully own anything in life. Is that everything in life is temporary, everything in life is fleeting, but more importantly, everything in life is arbitrary. The experiences we go through, the kinds of people that we meet. But what then is actually central to our life? I think the real story of our life, sure, is told through experiences, but experiences are felt through emotions. And the intuition pump here is the absence of the emotions we feel. The life we live is like an experience machine. It's something that's incredibly boring and incredibly unimportant. Emotions are what breathe color into the edges of our vision. It's what makes life meaningful. But most importantly, Judge, it's how we attempt to rationalize the experiences we go through as human beings. It's how we attempt to assert our own definition of what our life is and who we are. We think this uniquely gives you agency over your life, and we think you are completely allowed to feel the way you are. The premise and the extension of this impact is that catharsis is something that's incredibly important to the human experience. Just look at the creation of art. Look at how important art is for people. Look at how when people go on runs, how incredibly liberating this feels. It's something that's incredibly important. We think on your comparative, you stifle the emotions of people. We think something that's incredibly problematic. Number one, not only is it principally bad because you strip people away from their own agency, but oftentimes you subjugate the most vulnerable. Because not the framing of the people who are likely to be under the instances where they feel incredible amounts of resentment. They're probably people in toxic relationships. They're probably people going through a lot in life. We think when you force them to doubt themselves even more. We think when you shame these people for feeling emotions against their environment, that is when you push them to the bottom of their right. That is when you push them to the edges and the fringes of society. For all that I've said, I'm incredibly proud to propose.
All right, thank you for the defined speech to extend the case of opposition. Yeah, you're here.
Hi, give me a sec to prepare my timer notes. While doing that, my name is Dash for POIs. I prefer that you interrupt me. I'll always take the first. After that, I won't take any more. For pronouns, cheer. Give me one sec. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem on government side is not only that DPM could not even find like an agreement with their PM on their definitions, it's also that I don't think they understand how resentment actually posits in society when you come down to like bigger types of macro impacts. For example, when Sophia was very important when she told you about, for example, how this has affected us politically or historically. I'll get to those examples later on. But a few call outs. Number one, we tell you that hatred and resentment are different things. This is also what the PM said. In PM's definitions, we took them at their best panel. We literally did not hold a definitional challenge. It's so odd to me that you change the definitions and can't agree with your PM. We bit your definitions. You hope that remains the debate, right? We tell you that stigma is the bottled up feeling or the prolonging feeling of resentment because you feel as if you were wrong. We took that at its best. We tell you that yes, we agree with DPM that stigma and hatred are interrelated, but they're not the same feelings. We tell you then that stigma is still the bottle up of these emotions. We agree with PM. I don't see why they're both knifing each other. It's not slick and it's not going to help this debate at all. Secondly, let's work on the clash of toxic relationships since that's the hill they want to die on. They keep telling us that, oh, if there's no stigma, then apparently these people will get enlightenment and leave these relationships. Panel, why do you think that, let's bite their example, right? Why do you think your friends ultimately like hate on you, right? When you talk about the resentment you're getting in an abusive relationship, when you realize the fact that you're in an abusive relationship or there's toxicity in that relationship and you're already building resentment, why do people feel the need to talk badly about that? Because you do not want to be in a position where resentment is simply the overbearing feeling of, for example, how you're going to deal with your emotions. What do I mean by this? I mean that when you stigmatize this feeling and ultimately tell people that resentment is not the end goal of how you want to heal as an individual, what fulfillment looks like, we tell you then that resentment or stigmatizing it when your friends tell you that you shouldn't feel resentment in a relationship, that ultimately means, yeah, I shouldn't feel resentment to the person I'm supposed to love. I should not be abused in this relationship that I was supposed to be taken care of. We tell you stigmatization on resentment is always bound by the mere fact that we do not want people to bottle up their feelings or have these prolonged types of hatred. Sophia was very important in this because she already told you what does resentment and stigmatization look like and how do they go hand in hand currently in status quo. It's so odd to me because their paradigm was trying to tell you that, oh, their current values and ethics in society that are against resentment. Yes, that is stigmatization. Thank you for framing it for us. But for some reason, I don't understand why you're going so soft line in this case when all you had to do was prove to us why you do not want stigmatization. But even in your PM, you still frame it that like technically your policy is a soft line case of stigmatization. Fix your case before you talk about my first speaker. But okay, let's go directly into like constructives, right? One, stigmatization leads to discussions and awareness as to why resentment is unhealthy. Let's directly engage with DPM, right? Firstly, on mechanization, like let's mechanize the entire case because for some reason I don't think they understood that. So like let's run it back, right? Stigma leads to discussion. How? When people actively promote that something is bad in race, why it's harmful, you open up discussions as to how it may harm them. That's already existing in status quo. Why do we not oppose that? Essentially, when someone tells me you're in the wrong, or i.e., stigmatizes you for having that resentment on any individual whatsoever, it's not just bound by a toxic relationship. Stop squirreling the motion into into like your subjective type of one-line case, right? Like you're more likely to discuss it within yourself and take that possibility as opposed to living in your own bubble. Where is that, like why is that stigma needed? Because there's no one else present to prove the accessibility to awareness of these harms. They may tell us that, oh, these individuals can, for example, they can go to therapy, they can realize that resentment is bad in other types of forms. The reason why stigma was so important in, for example, Soph's explanations of Donald Trump or Hitler is because we told you what the most extreme effects of holding resentment to an individual is. Stop keeping it as like the most important matter of this debate. It's simply understanding how badly resentment could boil down to when not given stigmatization. Realize, right? Sure, therapy exists, but at the more accessible and wider level, stigma will be the more widespread belief because there's no one else present to prove accessibility to awareness of these harms. We think that raising awareness is at least better than not saying a word at all. We think that stigmatization still proves that, hey, on a platform level, these feelings are inherently problematic and toxic for you as an individual because we do not want you to bottle it up at the end of the day. But let's actually tackle these individuals, right? Soph gave you societal impacts. I'll prove to you then how we protect the individuals. Let's directly engage with our entire case. How does that affect individuals on four paradigms when you do not like stigmatization? When you like stigmatization. How is stigmatization going to lead to healthier and better individuals? Let's actually understand the clash then of this debate. Whether or not you like stigmatization and it actually nets you positive benefits. Right. Number one, if resentment was the norm and people bottle their feelings without talking to other people, why is bottling their feelings ultimately going to be harmful? Realize government kept telling you that yes, they should have this prolonged sense of deep understanding and awareness of their emotions. Yes, but what essentially does that mean when you prolong those feelings or when you delay conflict resolution, when you delay trying to get actual substantial solutions to your feelings? Why is that harmful? Simply, it allows them to simply stay in their hate. There's no push for them to get conflict resolution because there's no push back to tell them that they're wrong. This stigmatization is valid because it's the only type of mechanism to actually put into people's heads that, hey, this is toxic and it's unhealthy for you as an individual. Why, right? You stay in your hate and you let it consume you. We want to tell you, right, on government side, they do not easily get conflict resolution as opposed to us because you have a push that tells you that resentment is not the proper answer for you to get the healing process as an individual. Second paradigm, then, you let resentment harm your mentality because you let these have power over your feelings as opposed to your own growth and identity. Why is that so important in this debate that government never frames to you? Why? Stigma pushes you to not let that resentment strengthen over time. It literally makes you question yourself that should I actually be prolonging my hatred for this individual? Is that justifiable? It's the mere fact that stigmatization raises those discussions that are inherently important in status quo because no one else will do it. We tell you then stigma allows them to act and express their opinions. Government lets you simmer in those bottled up hate bottles and essentially does not allow them any growth or any type of long term healing, right? Let's go on to like the next paradigm. Healing process is easier to understand and actualize on the awareness of your own problems. Panel, if your friends are going to stigmatize you for holding resentment, wouldn't you actually realize, oh, maybe I'm more wrong? And you'd have a more in-depth analysis of your opinions. What do I mean by that? Side gov gets harder awareness because you don't have stigmatization. You have no one pushing you back. You actively tell your friends to simply support whatever feelings you hold. When you realize you bottle your feelings, you stay in the process of doubt and internalization of these feelings instead of trying to grow and get closure from these feelings. Realize we're telling you that we shouldn't oppose stigmatization because at the very end of the day, it's your pushback that ultimately grants you change in an individual that makes them more like driven to go and heal as an individual instead of bottling up their feelings. Resentment keeps you in one position. We tell you it's not good that you stay on that resentment and you prolong it. It's better for you to act on it or whatever types of means necessary in order for you to remove that resentment, whether that be in forms of hatred, whether it be like talking about it. We still tell you that resentment at the end of the day isn't going to solve your problems. It doesn't give you solvency for these individuals. For all those reasons and more, I've never been bothered to oppose. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your fine speech calling on government. Here, here.
Where can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're loud and clear.
No, I am so sorry. I don't know what opposition is running. Because they just say bits and pieces of what we say and take it out of context and then frame it as if we're making some huge contradiction and then completely ignore everything else that we say. What they then do they assert a bunch of stuff and then they try to co-opt their benefits of reflection, of closure, of how you move on. How? Why? I think Lauren gave you 7 minutes why they don't have this and why we do. Why is it then that they respond to none of it and just continue to pretend as if we said nothing? I think that's a fundamental lack of response. I think that's fundamental, like that is quite problematic, right? I think there's one big clarification since just opposition doesn't seem to want to listen to any of our speakers, right? I think what PM told you when she told you about the religious institutions or when she told you about affection is that there are already existing natural incentives to discourage resentment from forming in the first place. I think reasonably then, why we said this is because we wanted to prove that it was not important for this stigmatization to happen, because it's not that suddenly everyone will be like, oh yeah, let's sit in our resentment and stew over it for like the rest of our lives, right? I think reasonably, that's not what we said this thing for. And what then does opposition do? They take this thing, they spin it out of context, and they pretend as if that equates stigmatization, when we told you right from first, that is not what stigmatization looks like. We told you stigmatization looks like demonization. We told you it looks like demonization, it looks like shame, it looks like telling these people you are wrong for feeling resentment. I think saying that forgiveness is a good thing is very, very different from stigmatizing resentment to begin with. I think insofar as opposition doesn't want to deal with this at all, they don't actually fulfill that burden in this way. Now, second thing, I'm going to do three things in my speech. I'm going to tell you why, firstly, their lack of response or their shitty response to toxic relationships is fundamentally problematic. Second thing, I'm going to tell you why their lack of response then to why we have better genuine relationships on our side is automatically loses them to stay. Last thing, I'm going to be extremely charitable, which is something that opposition doesn't want to do apparently, and tell you why that even if all relationships crash and burn on our side, you sit in resentment for the rest of your lives. Why then is there still value in that? I think how Ming really tells you that. I think the lack of response from DLO there is very, very problematic, right? On the first clash on like toxic relationships, right? LO tells you there is good in beating yourself up. I think there is a fundamental problem when they acknowledge that victims beating themselves is a good thing. Because note how the beating yourself up when it comes to this stigmatization thing isn't a, why am I feeling resentment? No, it is a, oh my god, I'm a useless piece of shit. I'm unredeemable. I'm hating on a one person that loves me for who I am. I am worthless. I shouldn't leave this relationship. That is the kind of self-cycle beat up that happens on victims on their side when you make them feel even worse for having any form of resentment to begin with. Position then comes up and says, this is good. This is the internal meltdown that Lauren mechanizes for you. And their only response here is this is good. Just like look here how when this happens, right? Victims become even worse because now they have literally zero chance to leave. We told you why this is problematic for two reasons. One, they are vulnerable. Two, they have no other avenues for help. No response to any of this. I think this is the batshit crazy thing to run, right? Now, second thing that proposition wants to tell you, right? Oh, you stew in your resentment and your relationship just automatically fail, right? First response here, there's no make an impact to this. Like, I think reasonably why like you won't stew in the resentment is because like ultimately time heals all wounds, right? When you leave toxic relationships, you can move on because you feel safe enough to do so. Forgiveness and moving on only happens insofar as you are able to isolate yourself from the negative emotions that you had. When you are able to isolate yourself from the environment where that same fear held you back. Insofar as they don't prove why people will leave toxic relationships on their side anyways, is the point where they will actually continue to stew in resentment and be unable to move on. Victims will be stuck in an environment where they feel unsafe, where they feel scared, where they are unsure they're going to make it to the next day. And this is when they're going to feel like they can never move on and never make something better of themselves. I think on their side, you actually stew in resentment even more. Comparative here, what is the comparative? They still in the resentment, they don't prove why they move on. Because forgiveness and moving on does not happen just because you say it happens. Things like conversations need to happen. Things like getting closure needs to happen. I think these are necessarily difficult conversations that need to happen for people to even want to move on to begin with. I think insofar as they try to push this entire thing on us is the point where they fail in this debate, right? Because note here how this leads to the second clash on genuine relationships. Lauren already told you why forgiveness and moving on is likely to happen on our side. Because you actually talk to people. You have the incentive to share about what you feel. When you feel that you are able, that you are right for feeling this way, you are justified in feeling sad, you are justified in feeling anger. This is the kind of this like this feeling is really, really important because it gives you the confidence to talk to people about how you feel, what you have a problem with, and what you want improved. I think these are extremely difficult conversations but that need to happen in order for forgiveness to happen in the first place. I think insofar as they don't respond to this, it's extremely problematic because then they unlock all the harms that Lauren pushed onto them, which is where you have false friendships. You get people who feel like they have to act in relationships where they feel like they cannot be genuine, they cannot depend on their friends. This is extremely problematic then, because then the purpose of relationships is ultimately unfulfilled. You don't get any fulfillment in your relationships. You feel sad, you have no more support system, then why do you have friends for, right? I think the last thing they have to say on this genuine relationships idea is that resentment clouds your rationality. Okay, wait. I think the biggest issue here is that their case logic here is the equivalent, it's like parallel to people saying, yeah, women are too emotional and then they're very irrational. Like, no, right? Like, it's a logic leap, right? I think just saying that resentment clouds rationality is not enough to prove this as a solid line of mechanism. They need to mechanize this if they want to run this, right? But I think the comparative here is that they also have resentment, right? Like, just because you say, yeah, we stigmatize resentment, doesn't mean that resentment go away, right? I think this is something that Elmo already concedes when they say that resentment is a natural feeling that happens to anyone. They already said that resentment people will resent anyways. So what then is the comparative of this argument? Or like at best, on their best case, the harm here is symmetric. On their worst case, you make people feel even worse for feeling resentful because they feel like they can never actually talk about it. This is when you get all the bottling up that DLO wants to tell you. I am unsure as to why they are running this thing to begin with. Why is what Lauren told you then important? Because scale of impact. This is a problem that affects everyone, right? You got friends, I have friends. But friends are only valuable insofar as they can provide you comfort, right? If I'm put in a situation where I feel like I'm unable to interact with these people, that is when relationships become even very, very problematic. You don't fulfill the purpose of relationships. But here's how I'm going to be extremely charitable. Panel, I cannot stress this enough. I am going to be extremely, extremely charitable. But even if somehow relationships on our side, very, very bad, all crash and burn, what then? Why then do we still want this kind of thing, right? And here's where the principle that Ming tells you stands. Feeling emotions then is fundamental to the human condition. The reason why we have difficulty conceptualizing abstract concepts such as relationships or love is because these things are arbitrary. People experience these things differently. There is no right or definite answer or explanation. That's precisely why humanity is so vibrant and dynamic. It is our emotions that give meaning to our experiences. It is our sadness that makes happiness so much more meaningful. And this is crucial because it fundamentally shapes the way that perceive the world around us and who we are. So even if you are temporarily skewing in resentment, you know that this resentment is still making your life more vibrant because it's the fact. Because the fact of the matter is, it is your emotion. It is the way that you are perceiving the world in that moment. That is the agency that Ming tells you about that is so important. Because you give people a reason to live when they feel like they can actually live their lives rather than live in a false dynamic of what opposition wants to tell or of what opposition wants to tell you. For all these reasons, proposition wins this debate.
All right, thank you for that fine speech calling on opposition with here.
To clarify, I'm audible.
Yep, you're
Hello?
audible.
Hello? Am I audible? Okay, thank you so much. Okay. Give me a second to set up my notes and my timer. Okay. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in three, two, one, go. Chair panel, I think the major problem coming from government side is that firstly, in terms of role fulfillment, they have an inconsistent definition of what resentment actually looks like and what the stigmatization of resentment actually looks like. When they tell you in the first speaker, they tell you that it's a built up of emotions, that someone does something slowly over time, and that's how you get resentment. The second speaker tells you that it's just merely just hatred, and that it's exactly the same as hatred and anger, and that resentment and anger are the exact same thing. And then third speaker goes into debate, going backtrack to the first speaker and telling you that, oh, there that stigma is also like, sorry, that resentment is just a build up over time, right? This is already inconsistency. I don't see how their case flies with this. But before this, what else did they tell us? They told us then that in their framework, they're fine. They have people, there is an incentive for them to push outside of resentment because there are existing natural forces that tell them that resentment is wrong, i.e., values in society, i.e., religious teachings and traditions. Realize then, panel, let's understand what are these existing natural forces. They don't tell us what these existing natural forces are. Panel, these existing natural forces in society that push people to move away from resentment is stigma. Stigma is when people view an emotion or quality in human life as something that is negative, something that is wrong and should not be felt. If you feel that emotion, there is change that needs to be happen because that is not something that you should normally be feeling. That is stigma. They're literally arguing for stigma, right? But even let's like take the matter best case, right? Let's analyze the reason why the stigma happened in the first place. Why was there a reason for stigma? Sophia already brought this up in her first speech. This was left unresponded to even until last speaker. Panel, understand that the reason for stigma is because it usually doesn't really lead to critical thinking. The reason for the stigma against resentment is because it prioritizes emotions over rational thought. It focuses you to look at your feelings and lead with your emotions because you are feeling that way. There is no way out. Prioritize that feeling, right? Another problem that they have is that they seem to always focus on the micro scale, on relationships. They completely ignored the case line of Sophie and called it outright useless. When we tell you about on the most extreme and very visible examples of resentment, you see people literally using the prolonged resentment as form of propaganda to lead into prejudice, to lead into genocide. We tell you that the presence of the stigma against resentment, because we allow resentment to be seen as a bad thing that should not be felt in society, we call out and hold those feelings of resentment accountable. We hold people who feel resentment in society accountable for their actions. We tell them that your resentment is not valid. If you have a problem with this race or this group of people, you have to find a way to get rid of that resentment, find a way for you to express yourself in a way that doesn't actively harm that person, right? This is why Dash was my second speaker is also super important because we tell you about how we get that through the healing process. Before I go on to our three benefits of critical thinking, healing process, and conflict resolution on a micro and macro scale, let me tell you what their benefits are on government side and tell you how we co-opt them, even if their framework is inconsistent. We tell you then that when they tell us that, hey, they get to escape relationships because you don't beat yourself up for feeling resentment, right? That you're able to say that's fine. I'm feeling resentment. I acknowledge it. Oh, sorry, go.
So stigmatization means that on your side you don't feel any resentment?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Literally, when we tell you that there is a stigmatization of resentment, we tell you that people feel resentment because it is a natural feeling, but we tell them that you should not be feeling resentful if you want to maintain a happy and healthy life. That it is important for you to acknowledge that resentment and move on from it because that is not a feeling that you have to be harboring all around for the rest of your life. Resentment is a long-term feeling that is not healthy on someone's mental health. Let me just co-op your benefits and then I'll move on to how I deal with that better. Right? They tell you then that they're likely to escape relationships because you don't
Why?
beat. I already took one because you don't beat yourself up for feeling resentful about like your relationship. Two mechanization on how we co-opt this. Firstly, we tell you that stigma pushes the identification of resentment because it is a norm. The standard in society panel is to tell you that when you're feeling resentment, that is not a normal thing to have. We're telling you that when you're feeling resentment, it's a natural feeling, but that shouldn't be a natural thing that you should be harboring for forever because it's going to actively hurt you. We're telling you that you should not stay in that situation and you should get rid of that feeling because it's going to hurt you and the people around you. That is what you're saying. There are two releases to this. Firstly, we tell you that you're likely to see that you shouldn't be in that relationship and leave. That is the push to leave because society is pressuring you to get rid of that resentment. This is a push and an accusation and an urgency that you do not get on government side because they tell you there are magical natural forces that push you to do so. That you have introspection, and that suddenly introspection leads somewhere. An external societal push is a way better incentive and like a way better support system for you to get out of that. We tell you then that you're able to also repair or seek that out in a relationship to seek to repair it if that is the case. We tell you that resentment is bad, like resentment is bad. It is a built-in um it is a built-in mechanism that you should not be feeling. Dasha already told you this. There was an entire framework of her speech about how we have to acknowledge this resentment before we have a proper healing process. With that being said, let's go on to our benefits and how we are better than them, right? Firstly, on the level of critical thinking. We tell you then, panel, that because we stigmatize resentment, we don't allow it in the room for judgment. We tell you that we say, hey, fine, we acknowledge this resentment. Why do you resent that person? You should not have been resenting that person to begin with because that's not healthy, right? Well, why were you doing that? You allow them to analyze the reason why they're feeling that emotion to try to get rid of it. You have external forces pushing them to find a solution for that problem, right? We tell you that stigma pushes them to think critically because that is what is expected of you in society. Inclusivity, exclusivity, then on opposition side is that it is the norm that you have to get rid of that feeling and find closure and resolution. This is important because this is how we support victims on our side. This is how we support healing, growth. This is how we introduce the support of mental health. This is how we introduce the support of identification of problems when you're feeling something. Because if you don't see it as a problem, if resentment isn't stigmatized, then that means that, hey, it's fine for you to feel resentful. It's a part of a relationship. And you know what? That could magically change. We tell you that on a second level of healing process, we tell you that resentment as an emotion is a negative feeling that hinders and affects a person already. On the level of exclusivity, how are we better in opposition? We tell you that there's a push for people to get rid of that. There's a pressure to change and find a way out in order to stop that feeling. There's an awareness in society. We tell you that stigma causes awareness because stigma means people will talk about it because it's bad. People love talking about things that are bad, right? So you have an awareness in society for people to understand, to identify their situations in order for them to find an outlet, be it therapy or if they cannot afford therapy, to talk about it, to find a way to get rid of that situation. That's how we go out agency because people are able to identify their problem and find a way out of it. In terms of conflict resolution on two scales, micro scale, individuals and relationship people are pushed to be fulfilled. We tell them that fulfillment isn't just dealing with resentment and that is normal. Fulfillment is getting rid of that resentment and not having that lingering feeling of hate towards your partner or to anyone. On a macro scale, which again they did not touch upon and merely dismiss as invalid, we tell you that it holds people accountable and checks people in society so that they don't feel resentment towards large groups of people that lead to prejudice. The only harm that they talk about in our side is that victims are not allowed to feel resentful. We tell you then, panel, that we're able to bite the bullet. That's fine. We don't want victims to feel resentful because resentment allows them to harbor that hatred, allows their abusers to take control of their life even years after they've hurt that person because that feeling of resentment still controls and leaves a negative impact on their feeling as a person who's a victim. Realize for all those reasons: one, critical thinking; two, healing process; and three, conflict on a micro and macro scale, and how we're able to give victims leverage and agency over their life. We're able to better give them the benefit of the doubt. All those reasons and more. Proud to oppose. Thanks.
All right, thank you for your thanks speech calling on opposition reply.
Oh, sorry, just give us 1 sec. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government, just because you're mad, I don't think necessarily that yelling at a bunch of minors and using like curse words is gonna do anything in this debate. But let's run it back. Let's understand what the faults of this debate were and why opposition was able to mitigate that. If the burden in this debate was ultimately the stigma of resentment, what did that look like? PM was very important in this debate. Why? Because they proved to you that what stigma looks like, which is resulting from like existing um hatred in society. Of course, people are bound to not like resentment because it isn't a good feeling, it's a negative feeling. We told you that on the opposition side. Why should you like stigma at the end of the day? Because it pushes you, one, to get better healing processes. It gets you right to leave that toxic bubble of simply just wallowing in your like self-pity and like feelings, but actually get mitigable change. We think that government like came into this debate by simply arm swinging and telling us that you're not valid, you brought up Hitler, you have no mechanization. My entire speech as deep as DLO, right, simply proved all of that mechanization as to how stigmatization raises the awareness and discussions for these people to understand how resentment is like, problematic at the end of the day, or at least shouldn't be the norm in society that we should follow if you want someone to be self-actualized or at least self-fulfilled. We tell you then on opposition side, how do you solve toxic relationships? Because this is the only type of case that government decided to run. I'm pretty sure government wasn't expecting us to run societal impacts, yet here we are. So sure, let's be extremely charitable, like what their government whip said, and like let's bite their bullet. Sure, we stigmatize resentment of people who realize they're in an abusive relationship. No, that does not mean that we tell them, oh my God, stay in that relationship. What you're feeling is bad. Choo choo choo. This lacks so much of what me, Soph, and Mia tells us that it's laughable at this point. That this is literally a debate. We already told you, right? When you actually understand and stigmatize resentment in these types of relationships, give more nuance as to why mere push stigma telling someone if you resent you in an unhealthy relationship. I want you to put into consideration what house has fought for self-actualization or at least self-fulfillment in the sense that they are acutely aware of their like feelings and they're actually able to feel their emotions. On your side, you're simply telling us that, oh well, let them bottle in their emotions. It's going to be okay. They're going to like self-actualize. On our side, we don't want them to bottle up their feelings because it allows power or simply resentment to overpower all of their feelings. It clouds their judgment. It doesn't allow this person to be an individual at the end of the day because they're stuck in resentment from other actors in the debate. We tell you, why is stigma so important? Why should have you pushed for simply opposing it on government side, which for some reason they really didn't do? We keep telling you, stigma raises and it advocates for those discussions that you wouldn't even see. I literally preempted and I didn't respond to realize how then are you going to see stigma if you oppose it to coming in from resentment? You're only like actually healthy backbone to that, right? Would most likely be therapy, and not everyone can have therapy. We told you on accessibility, we want people to understand the situations that they are in. It's better to not prolong the feelings of resentment and actively engage upon it. I don't understand how you keep characterizing us wrong or taking out our frames of mechanization when we keep proving to you time and time again. And even if you're going to yell at us and you don't have mechanization, your only case falls if toxic relationships are already proven to be like fine in opposition because we literally give these people self-actualization that their thinking process shouldn't be a toxic prolonged state of bottling their emotions. We tell you on urgency, on likelihood, on literally the mental health of an individual that it's better for them to understand why resentment will not be good for you term and long term because it's not good for you to bottle up emotion that leads to an unhealthy mindset. It leads to an unhealthy, toxic relationship with you and other people surrounding you, with your friends, with your peers. We tell you on this side, why is it so good that you have stigmatization? Because you're an active force to tell someone that you're wrong. With all those reasons and more, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thanks.
All right, thank you for the speech to formally conclude the round. The open can finals calling on the government. Here.
I check I'm audible. Can I check I'm audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, give me a moment, yeah. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. You know, it's a minor of 17 years old. I've never been in an abusive relationship, but I sure can say that this is what this debate is starting to feel like. Because it feels as though we're trying to escape this debate. It feels as though we're bringing new points. It feels as though we're trying to have a meaningful discussion. It feels as though we're trying to be charitable. But it feels like we're debating against a brick wall. It feels like the opposition just won't listen. They won't understand what I'm trying to say. But most importantly, it feels like they're trying to gaslight everyone in the room. I'm going to make my reply speech extremely clear. I'm going at the end of this speech, Judge, you're going to be very clear about what you can buy and what you can't buy from both sides. Number one, I want to majorly clarify what this entire debate is about. The idea of stigmatization is that you make people feel bad for feeling emotions. So you tell people that it's not okay to not be okay. You feeling bad now is something that is bad. Secondly, what is resentment? I want to solve this imagined tension that they try to gaslight you saying we have. Yes, sometimes resentment is built up over the long term. Sometimes resentment is hate. You can have isolated incidences that cause large amounts of resentment. It can also be cumulatively built up over the long period of time. This is a very complex emotion. I don't get why it has to be one over the other. There's no tension within our case. We're just talking about resentment that manifests itself in different ways. But secondly, let's talk about their only mechanism in this debate, which I don't think really is a mechanism. Because, Judge, and hear about this. The extent of the opposition case is this. There's a people feel really resentful because they're in a bad situation because of all these reasons. You will go up to them and you will go, why are you feeling resentful? It's really bad. Stop feeling resentful now. Stop it. And they'll go, oh, sorry. I'm still feeling resentful now. And then people will just all magically not feel resentful. I don't get why this is the case. Presumably, they don't mechanize this. Oh, zero mechanization. So they're just going to go to a mentally affected person and tell them to stop doing this, and they will go, yes, emotions. Shut up. No more emotions. And they will stop feeling resentful. This is equivalent of saying that the extent of therapy should just be to go to a depressed person and tell them, stop being depressed, bro, just be better. This is absolutely ridiculous. But next, I'm going to be charitable here. If the only delta they want to talk about is the promulgation of the ideal within society that resentment is probably not something that's good to harbor in the long term, because the extreme characterization you push is the absence of this stigmatization. The moment I feel slightly angry, I will just sit there in resentment for the rest of my life. So what? Like, imagine I lose this debate, I will just be like, shit, what did I lose? And from now until I die 8 years old, every day I'll sit at my table and go, why did I lose the debate? Why did I lose? Why did I lose? Oh, and I'll be really, really angry. No, right? Presumably, our emotions are an indicator of how we feel. Anger doesn't feel nice. No one wants to feel angry forever. Time heals all wounds. Eventually, you will move on and you will rationalize. The difference is, on both sides, as they concede, people will feel resentful. The difference is on our side, you are able to express that resentment. The difference on our side, you're able to feel confident in your resentment because you're able to have confidence in your feelings as an indicator of whether the environment you are in is one that's good or not. This is the crucial mechanism that fills in the gap for the idea of toxic relationships. Because note, judge, the people in toxic relationships feel incredibly vulnerable. You cannot just tell them to get the hell out of this relationship and they will just leave this relationship. Oftentimes, there exists a lot of power asymmetry within these relationships. What you then need is to tell them that it's okay to not feel okay. You need them to be able to rely on their friends. You need them to feel confident with themselves. This is the only way you get them to break up and you get them to leave. But secondly, I think I want to point out the lack of response to the rest of our case. Firstly, on the idea of the principle, something that's incredibly powerful, something that automatically sidesteps all the analysis as an independent path to victory. While we explained to you that human agency means having a choice over your emotions, it means validating your own emotions. I told you in my speech was something that's incredibly important. We heard no response. We told you ideas about how this leads to more reflection, how is it people having more genuine relationships. We told you so many claims. At the end of the day, they haven't responded to any of them. So judge, what can you buy at the end of the debate? I think what you can buy is that sure, maybe there might be more, maybe on our side, people bottle up, sorry, maybe people show more resentment in the short term. But in the long term, the expression of this resentment needs some big problems at the butt. You get change, you get confidence, and you get humanity. For what I said, incredibly proud to propose.
All right, thank you for the time speech that formally concludes the round. Congratulations for everyone. We'll see you at convening for the announcements of the finals champion. Other than that, thank you. For the rest
Thank
of
you
the
for the debate.
panel, can we proceed? Oh,
Thanks for the debate.
seeing that there's no more breakout room, we can just like, I guess, send your decision to me. First for the finals best speaker and then for the finals champion. Again, um, the rest of the panel kindly send your decision on the finals best speaker and finals champion via DM. Thank you.